Today, our speaker is Professor Robert Lawson. Professor Lawson earned his PhD in economics from Florida State University in 1992. He is currently an associate professor of finance at Auburn University, and he serves as the co-director of the Center for International Finance and Global Competitiveness. He is the director of the Economic Freedom Initiative and is the co-author of the widely cited Economic Freedom of the World report, which provides economic freedom index for over 140 countries. Professor Lawson has numerous professional publications in journals such as Public Choice, Kiklos, Journal of Labor Research, Journal of Institutional Theoretical Economics, and the European Journal of Political Economy. He has served as the president of the Association of Private Enterprise Education and is a member of the Nontolerant Society. Today he's going to talk to us about the concept, measurement, and importance of economic freedom. Thank you, Professor Lawson.
What I want to know is why the essay that cited the Economic Freedom Index only came second. Demand a recount. Thank you, Pete. I didn't know it was Adam Smith Week when I accepted the invitation. I'm happy to participate in that because I wore my Adam Smith tie just minutes ago. I have 5 of them. So I have an Adam Smith set of cufflinks, and a lapel pin, and a money clip with Adam Smith. So I've got a little bit of an Adam Smith gay crush on Smith. So it's really is a pleasure to be here this week. I'm going to find which button to push. Talk about the concept, measurement, and importance of economic freedom. I want to try to set up the motivate what economic freedom project that I have been lucky enough to be part of. Motivate why we wanted to get involved in this project some 20 years ago when I was a graduate student. We started this project. Let's go backward in time. You all are students. Only a couple of people I can see are old enough to really remember the old Soviet Union and the debate about communism and free markets that went on 20 years ago or 100 years ago. When I was a student in the 80s, a college student like you, I had friends who were, for lack of a better word, socialists. Some of my best friends, and I was a little college Republican. I hate to say that now, sort of lost my Republicanness, but I was an early adopter of the general worldview that free markets work better, make more sense. But most of my friends were socialists of various kinds, or at least Democrats. And we would have these wonderful debates all the time, deep into the evening, with liquid encouragement. We would argue and argue and argue, and I would advance an argument about why free markets were better for society, and they would argue why government planning of some type or another would be better for society. We went round and round every night, months and months. We had fun doing it. It was a wonderful experience. But at the end of the day, I can't think of a single one of my friends who I convinced that I was right. And likewise, none of them made any headway with me. So it was a wonderfully, enjoyable kind of debate, but it didn't actually get us anywhere. And I'd like to sort of think about how that debate that goes on. I'm framing it here between Smith and Marx, and I'm using Smith and Marx a little bit unfairly, but just for the purposes of sort of putting personalities onto the debate. I think basically it's a debate between the worldview of Adam Smith, which is a worldview of natural liberty and free markets, versus the worldview of Karl Marx, which was a worldview of central planning. And anyway, so I'd like to think about how would such a debate go, how does debates like this go in, say, the natural sciences? What if two chemists had a debate? And just take a simple sort of story. What if the chemists had a debate? And one chemist says, he's an analytical chemist, so he's got all his equations and the things. I don't really know what chemists do, but he's got all these things, these little symbols, and he concludes that if you mix two chemicals together in a beaker or whatever, that you'll get a wonderful perfume. It smells like roses. His equations, that's what they said. And yet another chemist said with the same kind of same kind of models. He's got his equations, his mathematics, his way of thinking about it. And he says, well, you know, I think you're wrong. If you put those two chemicals together, you're going to get the smell of rotten eggs. And you can imagine these two chemists. Well, no, look, my model says that the two chemicals put together will smell like roses, and the other, no, my model says if you put the two chemicals together, they're going to smell like rotten eggs. Are these guys going to just argue night after night after night about whose model is better? No, what are they going to do? They're going to mix the two damn chemicals together and see what happens, right? And if they smell like roses, then the one guy is right. If they smell like rotten eggs, then the other guy is right. I mean, in the natural sciences, when you have a theoretical debate, you conduct an experiment. And sometimes in the purest natural sciences, you do that in a laboratory, but even in natural, like physics, astrophysics, for example, they can't conduct, for the most part, can't conduct laboratory experiments, but they still use evidence of the real world evidence in the universe and so forth to help settle debates. They don't just argue about it. And yet that's what most of us in the social sciences do. When we have a theoretical debate, we argue about it. So anyway, so that's the story. And I thought, and Jim Bortney, who's my senior co-author and mentor, and I was working for him, he came to me and said, you know, this is crazy. Why don't we go try to put together some evidence rather than argue over and over again about whether markets are better or not? And so that was the motivation for the Economic Freedom Project, to try to put together a measurement of what it means to be economically free, have a free market. And once you have the measurement in hand, then you can start asking questions. Does a free market smell like roses, or does it smell like rotten eggs? Okay, and that's where we are today. So let me talk about the project itself. Economic freedom is kind of a fuzzy concept, maybe. You know, it has a lot of elements. If you've read you know, the classic libertarian, Milton Friedman, Hayek, Adam Smith, you can get an idea of what that means. But just for quick purposes, basically, economic freedom means you get free markets. You've got individuals making choices for themselves about how they order their economic lives, what kinds of jobs they take, or decisions made by individuals. What kinds of products they produce, how those products get produced, prices of those products are made by individuals. And trade occurs between voluntary individual choice. There's no grand plan for these individuals. They're simply actors who are doing their own, going about their own lives as they see fit. That's the idea of economic freedom. It's a little fuzzy, but you know, a lot of things that we try to measure are fuzzy. Gross domestic product, you've all studied that, right? What is that? It's everything we produce in the country. Everything we produce in the country. Well, think about what do we produce in this country. We produce haircuts, cars, people wash dishes. I mean, we produce all kinds of crazy things. Actually, if you think about the amount of stuff we produce in this country, it's pretty fuzzy also. And yet, we plow ahead. Statisticians in Washington plow ahead, and they measure GDP. And do they do it perfectly? No. We all had classes where they talk about the various measurement issues and problems associated with measuring GDP. But we still do it because it's important. Economic freedom is a little fuzzy, but I think if we can get a quantitative measurement of it, at least in a rough sense, like we get a rough measure of GDP. So let's. All right, I could talk for hours about the methodology of the index. You don't really want to have that lecture. Let me just sort of sum up what we do. It's a data collection exercise. I have collected data on 141 countries. The index itself is based on 5 areas. I'll mention those 5 areas in a moment. But within those areas, it's about 42 pieces of data. So I collect data from all over the world, like the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, PricewaterhouseCoopers produces a lot of good tax data. But there's a group called the World Economic Forum out of Davos, Switzerland, and they conduct a lot of surveys around the world, and then those data are used. There's the World Bank has another project called Doing Business Project, where they put out all kinds of measurements. So I collect data from all these sources. It's important to know I don't sit in my office in Auburn, Alabama, I wonder how Madagascar is doing this year. I just collect data from these various sources, and they all gets thrown into my computer, and I turn the sausage grinder, and out comes numbers 0 to 10s. 10 means you're closer to Adam Smith's worldview. 0 means you're closer to Karl Marx's worldview. Okay. And if you're a Marxist, it's cool with me. Marxists are a lot of fun to go drinking with. Just flip those numbers. You want to make the 10s better? That's fine with me. I don't care. But since I'm doing it and I like markets, I'm going to make the higher numbers better. Okay. The data itself really come in two forms. One is quantitative, so-called hard data, tax rates, tariff rates, inflation rates, things like that, numbers. And to the extent possible, we like to use hard numbers when we do the index. There are a lot of things that, like how secure is property? A little bit hard to get a number for that. So we use surveys. So we have the index is put together with both hard data like tax rates and also some soft data, something called soft data, which is based on surveys of people where, again, the World Economic Forum, again, will ask people, okay, so if you're in Peru, how secure do you feel property is in Peru? And they conduct a big sort of survey with hundreds and hundreds of respondents, and we get an answer, on some scale that they use to tell us how secure property is, for example. So we have a combination of hard and soft data. There's no way to do an index like this without using some survey data, because some of the elements of economic freedom we care about are just fundamentally hard to put a numerical, a hard number on, like you do with, say, taxes. Lastly, the transparency is one of the highest values of the project. I'm a sort of an academic egghead here, and this is actually the book. And if you look at it, it's mostly. This is not something you just pick up and read at night. It's just numbers, right? And one of the important things that Courtney and I, I'll give this to you, by the way. One of the important things that Courtney and I decided to do when we started the project was we wanted to have everybody know where we got the numbers. So every one of those numbers, you can find the original source for it. You can go look it up yourself. And it's not a black box. There are a lot of indexes around out there. There's another economic freedom index put out by some other group, I forget their name, I won't talk about them. Theirs is more of a black box. You just open the page and it has a number 4. And it's not really clear how they got the number. So we really are careful, as careful as we can be, so that the entire index methodology is open for inspection. And believe me, I get emails and letters all the time. And sometimes the letters are right. They say, hey, the number you have is wrong. It's really, our tax rate is really 4.2 and you've got 3.8. Oh, okay, so I'll sometimes make a correction if it's a data mistake. But it's very open to the public, open to inspection, so that we can improve the index when we get complaints. But also so that if someone calls me and says, Lawson, you got Peru's number wrong, I'll say, well, here are the numbers. What numbers are wrong? Right? It's just very scientific, and it helps. I think it's helped the project get a lot of respect among scholars. Okay, so these are the 5 areas. For most purposes, if you're using the index, if you're a user of the index, there is an overall index, which I'll discuss in a moment. But if you are a user of the index and you want to sort of look at different parts or areas, this is probably the best way to do it. There's 5 areas. The first area is size of government in a fiscal sense, and sort of how big is the government, and sort of taxes and spending. Adam Smith's worldview was a minimalist government worldview, and Karl Marx's view was pretty much an expansive role for government. So you get better numbers when you have smaller governments in a tax and spend sense. The second area is the legal structure and property rights. There's 7 different variables in that area from 3 different sources, and they're all basically questions about how secure property is, how efficient the courts work. One of the variables, for example, is how many days does it take to settle a contract dispute in the court? In America, it's about 300 days. It's 1 year, basically. Typical contract dispute is resolved by the American courts in about a year. In some places, it's 34 days. In other places, it's 3,000 days. The court systems basically don't work. And since courts or how we protect our property rights. It's important to look at that. The third area is how secure you are in the little green pieces of paper in your pocket, how secure your savings, and basically it's how much inflation is there, various types of measures of inflation. Fourth is international trade, freedom of trade, tariffs, quotas, capital controls, as well, different areas. There's a whole bunch of areas there. And the last one is a big area with on all kinds of peculiar regulations in credit markets, like interest rate controls, labor markets, minimum wages, hiring and firing regulations, severance pay, things like that. And then also general business regulations, like do companies have price controls, how long does it take to start a business, the regulatory red tape, and so on. Okay. So there's 42 pieces of data, but they're collected into these 5 areas, and users of the index usually who focus on the will focus on the areas when they're looking at the numbers. Well, let's talk about the numbers. So I put all these 42 numbers in 5 areas in the computer. And at the end of the day, it all gets sort of averaged out into a single number, 0 to 10. So 10 again is good from the Friedman, Hayek, Adam Smith view of the world, and 10 is, or 0 is sort of good if you're a Marxist. Now, the couple points. This is the most recent data from the 2008 report that came out last September. The data are for 2006. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with 141 countries, there's a certain considerable lag for data to get reported and bubbled up through the various bureaucracies. The IMF, they got statisticians look at it, they got to print it in a book or put it on a CD. And so I'm always looking to, I'm like a physicist, everything is 2 light years away when I do this. Okay. So if you have any questions like what's going on today, I'm going to have to ask you 2 years from now. That's how long it takes the light to get to me. This is the top 10. Not too many surprises, maybe a couple. Hong Kong is number 1. They've been number 1 since we've been doing the index. We actually have data all the way back to 1970. Hong Kong has been number 1 every year that we have the index. And I didn't need to do the index for this. I mean, everybody knows Hong Kong's the greatest economy. You read Milton Friedman. He made Hong Kong famous for being the most free market economy, and it clearly is. They are number 1, and they are not even close to number 2. The numbers here, by averaging out and putting everything into 0 to 10s, it makes number 1 and 2 look really close to each other. But take it from me, Hong Kong is far and away the freest economy on the planet. I think it's the freest economy to ever exist on the planet. And Singapore is number 2, and they're not really that close to Hong Kong. It only looks like they're close because of the way the data is being put together in the index. A couple observations about the top 10. Notice Singapore. This is an economic freedom index. It is very narrow in our focus. We are interested primarily in the most narrow kind of economic life: production, distribution, consumption of goods and services. In that domain, Singapore is a very free market economy. If you want to open up a business, you can do so in Singapore with very little red tape, very little taxes, no tariffs. It's a very good place to own and operate a business. But Singapore is one of the weird countries which has a lot of economic freedom, but doesn't have a lot of political and civil freedoms. One of the research questions that I'm interested in fact, I'll talk a little bit about this afternoon with the faculty, is what is the relationship between economic freedom, leaving people alone to go about their economic life, versus political and civil freedom, sort of leaving people alone in terms of who they marry, how they marry, freedom of speech, press, things like that. The two usually align. Look at the rest of the list there. United States, Canada, most places that have economic freedom, a lot of economic freedom, also have a fairly large amount of political and civil freedom. But Singapore stands out as an exception in that domain. Chile has just reached into the top 10. This was the first time they've ever achieved the top 10. They're clearly the most free economy in Latin America. Number 11 is not on there, but number 11 is Estonia, and they're clearly the most free of the former Soviet bloc countries. And Estonia today is really a miracle. They're having some troubles with the financial crisis, like a lot of places, but they clearly have come the farthest away from the old Soviet central planning system that they left in 1991. United States is now 8th, by the way, and they've been declining, and I blame George Bush for that. It's an open question whether or not it's going to go back up or continue to fall. Now, 141 countries, way too many countries to show here. So I just threw in an extra slide giving you some of the larger, more interesting countries. If you're interested in, Cote d'Ivoire or someplace, I'll have to look in the book. But these are some of the larger countries. Germany is still a fairly free market economy, which is by world standards. Notice Sweden's pretty high. I get debates all the time between Sweden and the audience. I usually get debates with them. We used to think of Sweden as a socialist country, and relative to the United States, it clearly is not as free market as the United States. But think about Sweden. Most goods and services in Sweden are produced by private companies. The people who live in Sweden live in private homes. The jobs they take are pretty much the jobs that they decide to take for themselves. Property rights in Sweden are secure. Swedish courts are probably better than American courts. Okay? Trade, can Swedish people trade with all around the world? Yes, very free trade environment. And actually, except for labor markets, regulations in Sweden are probably easier and more lax than they are in the United States, except for labor. Labor regulations in Sweden are practically totalitarian, but except for that one area, Sweden is, structurally it's very much like the United States. They got higher taxes than the United States, and they got some extra labor regulations, but structurally Sweden is a lot closer to the United States than it is. It's a lot more similar to the U.S. than it is dissimilar. Okay. Anyway, you go on down the list, you see India and China. India has been moving up rapidly, as is China, but they're still fairly low rated. India is about halfway down the map, and China is still below the 50% cut. China today is weird because they have everything from Hong Kong-like freedom in places like Shanghai, and then if you go to an interior province, it is still communism reigns. So numerically, the estimate I have in my back of the envelope estimate is about 300 million people in China live in sort of free market-oriented conditions, but about 800 million live in jackboot communism, the old-fashioned kind where you can't do anything without the local political authority giving you permission to do that. So I think overall, China is still got a long way to come. Parts of China have just been colossal. It's been great. But as a country, we have, the rule here is number one per country. So as an entire country, China still gets a pretty low rating. It's a little bit deceiving because, again, parts of China are very, very free. Russia's a disaster. Two tragic cases, of course, Zimbabwe and Venezuela. Zimbabwe, I don't need to speak to. They are dead last. That's relatively new. I mean, the decline in Zimbabwe is relatively recent. If you go back to the 80s, Zimbabwe would have been one of the higher rated African countries. Now, they weren't very high in the overall scheme of things, but they were one of the higher functioning, more market-oriented economies. It's only in the last decade that Mugabe's gone insane and has ruined the place. Venezuela is truly tragic, though, because Venezuela in 1960 probably is the richest or the second richest Latin American country, maybe second to Argentina. And they were a very market-oriented economy. It was also the most liberal political regime in Latin America. Their democracy was as high a functioning a democracy as Latin America has ever had, comparable to, say, Costa Rica. Of course, the last 20 years has been a disaster economically. The economic freedom index, they're almost last. The economy's in shambles. The growth rate in Venezuela the last 20 years is negative 1% per year on average. Every year, people have gotten 1% poorer for 20 straight years. Okay. That's not a recession, right? I don't know what word that is, right? That is a whole nother category. And they've gone from being about the richest country in Latin America to being not Haiti, but they're clearly now one of the poorer Latin American countries. Politically, they've also gone south, especially under Chavez. They have sacrificed a lot of their political and civil liberties for Chavez as well. So it's a real tragic case on all dimensions. Just to give you a little bit of flavor of the whole world, this is a color-coded map that we put on the cover of the book, and every now
now and then we go poster. And it gives you a sort of an idea of the distribution of economic freedom around the world. You can see Africa is very red. We're old-fashioned, so red means, commie, so, and blue is freedom, so I think that's exactly backwards. Today in political maps we do in the United States, it's always like Republicans are red. I don't know how they figure that out, but anyway, in my world, red is bad. You can sort of get an idea. You can see that the United States and Western Europe is the greens and the blues. The blues basically are upper 25% group. The greens are the second 25%. The yellows are sort of the third quarter, and the reds are the lower quarter. It's scaled a little bit beyond that. That's basically the idea. A few things about worth noting. You'll see the oil countries. The oil countries right there. That's Oman and United Arab Emirates, Kuwait. They're blue. They're pretty free market economies. Again, not liberal democracies by any means, but they're pretty free market economies. If you want to open a business, Oman would be happy to let you come there, and they're not going to mess with you. They're not going to get a lot of regulations or taxes or anything like that. Just, pretty good. Don't open up. Don't start a newspaper. But you can start any other news. Criticize, insult. That would be bad. But you can open up a shoe factory. There's no problem. There is a little country, right? You see that one right there? It's blue. Do you know what country that is? Georgia? Georgia, yeah. I'm a bit of a Georgia file. I've been there several times. I'm going again this summer. I was actually there this summer when the Russians invaded. They were 50 kilometers away, and the only thing between their tanks and me was like 2 Georgia cops. My wife was not happy back in the States. Anyway, Georgia is blue, and that puts them in the upper 25%, and it's that puts them in the upper 25%, and that's not just my index. The World Bank has listed Georgia as the fastest reforming country in the world, and so it's been, they've got a lot of problems, but it's one of my favorite places to talk about. And lastly, you can see the real contrast. Argentinians and Chileans hate each other, and the red, Argentina, and blue, Chile, is really a stark contrast. The economic performance of the two countries has, I think, reflected the difference in the path that they've taken. Chile is a booming country that's on the path of prosperity, and Argentina's not. Maybe I can ask questions about this.
I'm just curious. I realize that this is probably an aggregate of the entire index, but
Yeah.
it's curious to me that you've got Canada in the blue, comparable with the U.S. and some of the other countries that you mentioned.
Yeah, in the scale of the world, Canada and the United States are almost indistinguishable. I mean, and if you look at the index itself, actually Canada is a little higher rated now. It's new.
Well,
And when we think of Canada, the thing that stands out, of course, national health, health. But you know what? Aggregate taxation in Canada is only a smidge higher than the United States. And after Obama's done, it looks like I'm going to guess that next year Canada will have a smaller aggregate government in a fiscal sense than the United States. If you look at the other dimensions, free trade, Canada's about the same. Monetary policy is about the same. Regulations, some are worse, some are better, but you're really splitting hairs. So again, since I'm looking at the whole world, when you look at the whole world, you put everybody on a scale. The U.S., the differences that we see that look so big in the scale of the world it's the same thing, that's why I mentioned Sweden. In the scale of the world, of course, you can actually see the difference between Sweden's economy structurally and ours, but in the scale of the world, they're pretty close. That doesn't mean those differences don't matter, but again, the differences that really matter around the world aren't the differences between Canada and the United States. The differences between Canada and the United States and Angola. That's the real difference that matters in terms of why Angolans are poor and American Canadians are rich.
talk about that. Nice segue. This is not high fancy econometrics. For those of you who have had econometrics and the professors here, you can do that if you'd like. You're going to get roughly the same answer. And since this book is half a scholarly exercise and half a journalistic exercise, for journalists, we can't put any multiple regressions and teach statistics. They don't. Journalists are stupid. They don't know any of that stuff. So we give them nice, easy bar charts that they can put in their newspaper, and hopefully they won't even. They'll just copy and paste because we won't make any mistakes. Anyway, this is the I should say quarter, not quartile, but math majors would get mad at me. But this is did it again. Golly. This is the average income level using GDP per capita, purchasing power parity measure. This is the best the least bad way of judging how developed the country is. And the top 25% have an average of about $30,000 per person in income. The bottom group has one about $4,000 per person. There's some variation. If you want to do a scattergram and a regression line, you'll get the variation. But pretty much, the higher you are on the economic freedom scale, the richer the country is. This goes to sort of that mixing the stuff. So this is the picture that I want to go back in time and show my socialist friends. Because they really, this was not an obvious, to us today, this seems obvious. Duh, market economies are richer than non-market economies. Duh. That was not an obvious point 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It was debatable. People would say with a straight face, I think central planning will yield better economic results. Central planning will get more regulation and more government control, will actually get us a stronger economy. And no, it's not true. Okay? So, and now we have the data to sort of demonstrate that, and that's what's cool about the internet. This is growth. Growth is a little bit harder. This is how fast you're growing, not how rich you are in a level sense. There is a general upward trend. To really understand growth, though, you need to do real econometrics. The growth process is a little bit more complicated. You need to do a real academic econometric type study. The good news is those studies have been done, and a recent survey of those studies basically said that, you don't need to read the whole quote, basically that quote says that all of the studies that have been done that look at economic freedom and growth show that higher economic freedom countries grow more rapidly than the ones less. So it's harder to see in a simple bar chart, and that's unfortunate. It'd be nice to have a nice bar chart for that, but it really doesn't exist in a simple relationship. Okay, so my friends, go back to my socialist friends. If I made any headway with them, I could sometimes get them in the middle of the 80s to say, yeah, it does look like maybe free markets, economies outproduce socialist economies. Some would admit that, but every now and then someone would admit that. Then they would say, but free market economies screw poor people. They hurt the poor. The distribution of income is too unequal. I don't know. Didn't really have a good answer for that back then. This is the average income, or the share of income held by the poorest 10%. Okay? So if you take 100 people, you're going to have the poorest 10%. So the question is, what share of all of the money earned does that poorest group of 10% have? Okay. It turns out, what do you see there? See much? It's pretty much a flat line, isn't it? I mean, bottom line is, if you go all around the world and you look at how much of the total slice, how much of the pie the poorest 10% gets, it's about 2 to 3% of the pie. Whether you're in Angola or the United States or Sweden or wherever, it's about 2 to 3%. There's some outliers that go down to like 1.5, and some that go up to maybe 4, but it's a pretty tight. The bottom line is everywhere in the world is going to have a bottom 10%. It has to be bottom 10%. And if you look around the world, they get about 2 to 4% of the pie.
no matter where you are. And it doesn't correlate with economic freedom, whether you're using a market or not using a market to organize life. So it isn't true that market-oriented economies have more unequal distributions of income. Now, in the popular debate, people will cherry pick their data and they'll compare the United States with Sweden. Well, the United States has a somewhat more unequal distribution of income, and Sweden has a very equal distribution of income. So people will cherry pick it and they'll say, well, look, the United States has, and we're more market than them, so you'll take that. If you look at the data, there's no evidence that market-oriented economies have more income inequality. There are a few studies out there that basically said the same thing. I do know one thing, though. If you are in the bottom 10%, you're better off in a market-oriented economy because market-oriented economies are richer. Having 2 to 4% of a bigger pie is more money, right? So this is the income level of the bottom 10%. And in the United States, the lowest 10%, the people in the bottom 10th of the United States population have an income per person of about $12,000. And it's a little bit less than that in the most recent quartile. But and then if you go to the the bottom, it's almost nothing. It's about a 9 to 1 difference. Okay. A couple others. Economists get criticized justly and rightly so for being obsessed with money. I actually don't understand that criticism, frankly, because money is simply a representation of value. But if I can have a little brand moment there. But if you want to use non-monetary measures, you can do that too. And there are a lot of these in the book. My sort of favorite is the life expectancy chart. This is life expectancy from birth, organized again with the 25% groupings. It's about a 20-year difference between, on average, if you live in the top 25% versus the bottom 25%. This is a huge difference. I mean, this is the difference between, if you die at 57, you probably won't see your grandchildren grow up and marry and have kids. If you lived at 80, you're going to see your grandkids grow up and you're going to see them have kids. A lot of people never even get to meet their grandkids because they're dead. They're statistically dead before. And I don't know if there's any grandparents in the room. The grandparents will tell you that one of the best things in the world is grandkids. And one of the real human costs of living in one of these lower economic freedom societies, one of the human costs is that you don't get to meet your grandkids, or a lot fewer of them do. And that's a tragedy. It's a human tragedy. It's real life, right? So it's not just about money. This is the Political and Civil Liberties Indexes, and I am too lazy to change the scale. I should note that the group that does a Political Rights Index and a Civil Liberties Index is called Freedom House. And for them, lower numbers are better. They've been doing it 30 years. It's their life. I just doesn't make sense to me. I think higher numbers should be better. But they, so for them, they use a scale that's like 1 to 7. And 1 means you're very liberal politically, freedom of press, and civil freedoms, and so forth. So that's why it's going the other direction. But this is still telling the story that I think makes sense. There is a very strong gross correlation between political and civil liberties and economic freedoms. It's not perfect. There are a few Singapores out there, right, where they're off. But overall, countries that have liberal economies also have liberal political and civil regimes. So if you care about freedom of speech, press, religion, whatever, a market-oriented economy is not only is it not a threat to those goals, it appears to coincide with those. And lastly, I'm not much of an environmentalist, but there's an environmental index that some green people put out. They're not literally green. I think at Columbia University and or Cornell or some such place up north where it's cold. They put out an environmental performance index. It's scaled from 0 to 100. Higher numbers mean better environmental performance. It's an index like mine, so they cobble together a whole bunch of data, and they get a 0 to 100 scale. Okay, so again, one of the arguments you might hear today is that market-oriented economies degrade the environment. Well, the evidence that we have, and there's some studies that are coming out, real econometric studies, there just really isn't a lot of evidence for that either. If you look at the worst environmental record, it tends to be in countries that have a lot of government control, and the countries that have markets have actually outperformed. In part, that's because we're richer. Market-oriented economies are richer. We can afford things like water treatment plants and so forth. But there is no trade-off between having a market economy and a bad environment. I mean, there's no trade-off there. You can have both. On average, anyway, there's a strong relationship there. And this is just the easiest way to sort of tell that story. Okay. And sort of last, I want to plug the website. Some marketing genius, our publisher, came up with this stupid URL called freetheworld.com. I loathe that name. Some marketing major probably came up with that. Sorry, if there's any in the room. But anyway, you can go to the website, you can download the book and print it out. Go to the College of Charleston library and print it out on their nickel. You can also download the data, all of the data in Excel spreadsheets. So if you're in econometrics classes and want to go run some regressions, you can get the data very easily on the website. It has previous editions. There's also an essay in each one of the chapters, or each one of the books is a special essay. This year it's on poverty in the world. Last year we had Bill Easterly did one. A couple years ago, Bill Easterly did one on foreign aid. We had one on economic freedom and war. Turns out that countries are a lot less, like 40 times less likely to go to war if they're in that top quartile versus the bottom quartile. It's a huge peace relationship associated with economic freedom. And that actually came from a political science professor at UC San Diego. Okay. So anyway, the website is a real nice resource if you're interested in this stuff. And a little bit of environmental. I do climb mountains. That's Kilimanjaro. So that's just there because I wanted to have something to add. Okay. I don't know what time. Questions?
We've got there are 2 questions. Anybody has it?
How many years have you been doing this?
Well, the first edition of the book came out in '96. We've been doing it every year since. In terms of the data, though, we have data in 5-year intervals going back to 1970. So even though we started in the 90s, we went backward and cobbled together the old numbers. So we have 70, 75, 80, 85, 90, 95, 2000, and then from 2000 forward, it's annual. 2001 through 6.
Question about how you measure property rights. Do you only use survey, or is there any other proxies, kind of like international investment or
Right.
security and bill?
Yeah, there's 3 sources there. 2 of them are essentially surveys. One of them is a real survey where the World Economic Forum distributes in each country hundreds and hundreds to business people, and they get responses. One is a executive rating service by, it's an investment rating service by a group called PRS Group, which is in New York, and they actually sell risk analysis to companies, and they're kind enough to give me some of their data. And the other one, though, is a World Bank data set, which is really cool. It's that doing business project that I mentioned. That's the one where they actually go out and they hire people in every country and ask them to, they don't literally try to create a business, but they ask them to go through a mental process of how long it would take to, say, start a business. And they have a couple things on property rights, like how long does it take to settle a contract dispute. And so you get a number, like 46 days, And so it's kind of a case study. It's not really a hard number, but it's a lot harder than just a survey response. So it's a mix. And I'm really happy to have those data, because for a long time all we had was surveys. Yeah.
Have you done much really a relative comparison of the first quartile countries? I mean, as far as development, as far as GDP, are they all pretty similar? Or?
No, there's variation. I mean, especially because in the first quartile, you have some up-and-coming countries that are still relatively poor, like Chile and Estonia. So yeah, there is variation within that group. But I think the lowest income in that top quartile, though, is still $10,000 per capita. So, the bottom of the top quartile is still better than the top of the bottom, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious, how's the kind of response you get to this? So say your socialist buddies, do you get a lot of combative blowback from people, or is it
I actually get,
well received?
I get more annoying emails from libertarian friends than I do. I mean, really, people in New Zealand libertarians in New Zealand are nuts. The email usually is, "We're not that good. We're not that free. We have all these rules, regulations, taxes." And it's true. It's kind of on a relative scale. I mean, if you're an anarcho-capitalist, every country gets a zero. You know, column of zeros. Well, that's very helpful, right? So there are a lot of guys out there that simply don't think in a continuum. It's zero, their world is 0-1. You either are a free market economy or you're communist, totalitarian hell, you know? And there's no great shades of gray in the middle. Well, this project is necessarily shades of gray. So I get more of those feedbacks. But occasionally I do get the other side. This is kind of a funny story. The ambassador to the United States from France called me in my office. It was really one of those, you know, Dr. Lawson, please hold for the French ambassador. Or, you know, what? So, and he got on and he was upset because France is like 40th and kind of slipping down. And he said, well, you know, we have all these wonderful rules. Yeah, I know. Like, you know, I said, yeah, you've got the maximum. This is when they had the big maximum hour rule, 37-hour a week maximum, and they were enforcing it religiously, even among like business executives. You know, is there a business executive on earth that works only 37 hours? I mean, come on, right? So they were raiding corporate offices to see if the CEO was there more than 37 hours a week. Same. And I said, you know, that's an example. You guys got these rules, and they're infringing on people's freedom. It's like, no, those are good rules. That makes us more free. So he just didn't get it, right? He just didn't understand what I meant when I said freedom. Like the freedom to work, you know, 37 hours in 1 minute is, you know, he was using it in a different sense. I get some of those. Pakistan embassy sends me an annual email complaining. And to a certain extent, actually, that's been good because they've actually corrected some mistakes, you know, where the international data were outdated and they had current data. So it's not entirely useless.
Within the United States, with everything that's going on right now, we seem to be moving towards more regulation. I mean, have you used this, or how would
Well,
you incorporate this into your discussion of, you know, what that's going to do to us? Because people say that's supposed to help us. More
Actually,
regulations supposed to help us.
yeah. Well, you know, there's two answers. One is what's going to happen in the United States, the new stuff. The other answer is, you know, some regulations may be good. Some taxes may be good. I'm not saying anything really here about whether these are good or bad. But, you know, let's not force them. A new regulation or a new tax makes us less free, period. Maybe it's a good idea. So one thing is you need to separate the idea. The question is this regulation a good idea from the question is, does this regulation make us freer? Regulations don't make us freer, they make us less free. But they may still be good ideas. One example is conscription. A friend of mine in Israel, you know, we get conscription in Israel. Yeah. And that's one of our variables. And they get a low rating, make it a 0. Because it's long-term conscription. Says, yeah, but we really need conscription. You know, they're going to take us over. I say, yeah, you know, if I was you, I would support conscription too. But let's not say that makes us freer. It makes us safer, or, you know, there's other words we could use. It doesn't make us freer. It forces people to go work for the government for, you know, 3 years. Maybe it makes us safer. So that's one answer. The other answer is, what's going to happen in the United States? Actually, in area 1, the fiscal size, the stimulus bill was about 3% of GDP. I mean, government's going to get bigger, so that number's going to go down. But area 2 in the United States on legal structure, security, property rights, that's where the U.S. has been slipping the last decade. It went down 1.5 points on a 10-point scale. It's a huge drop. The United States had the largest drop in area 2, except for Venezuela and Angola and Zimbabwe or something. I mean, you know, if Obama is going to do anything positive, it's probably going to be good there. You know, I don't know exactly why. You asked a question about the survey in area 2. You can't tell always why, but all the numbers, all 7 of them are going down in the United States. People, there's a sense of why. I think it's the Patriot Act, maybe it's Kilo, it's, wireless tapping, or taking your shoes off the airport, it's whatever. I mean, there's all this sense of that we're not as secure property-wise as we were. I think that's most of those things are likely to improve under the new administration. So, so I see area 1 going down likely, and area 2 probably going up, and I'm not sure about what the net effect is. I suspect we're gonna keep going south.
I mean, looking at, compared to other countries,
Say what?
looking at other countries, we're still significantly above a lot of countries though. in a lot
Oh,
of
yeah,
ways.
yeah,
So
we were
even if there
8th,
is-
but we were as high as 2nd, and we've been 3rd for most of the periods of the index, so. And it's not just, again, it is it's small, and in the context of the world, going from 2nd or 3rd to 8th isn't a big deal. But it's real. I mean, it is a real drop. It's not like statistical noise. It's not just a little blip and we're going to go back. It's actually quite quantitatively real that the U.S. has fallen. And I don't think today, I really thought the U.S. really was the best large liberal democracy, free market. I can't say that today. All right, I mean, seriously, I think a lot of other liberal democracies